welcome to this week's installment of our monthly paint along, week 2. Week 1, we made the plan for our painting, so hopefully by now you have done a thumbnail, you have selected the colors that you want to use for your painting, and you're ready to do the underpainting. So the underpainting is just the setup. It's just that very first layer. It can either be pastel or we're going to do a wet underpainting with, I'm going to use art graph, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But this is simply just to get us started. It's to give the painting a boost. And there are many different reasons and ways to do underpainting, and we have studied this in the past. You can look up underpainting and find out a lot more, and we will cover it again because it's such an important part of my technique is to do some sort of underpainting. So this week I decided we'll do a wet underpainting. And I talked about last week that I was going to use white pastel matte, and some of you wrote in and said, oh, can I use a different paper? I don't have pastel matte. Perfectly fine. My only suggestion is that you work on a light color piece of paper. So white, UArt is a very pale color. That's perfectly fine. But if you use a dark color, your underpainting is just not going to show up. It just doesn't work to the best advantage to use darker colored paper. I also had someone write to me and said, I have used pastel matte in the past and did wet underpaintings and with water, and the paper completely buckled, so much so that she had to throw out the paper. So I thought, oh my goodness, I don't want that to happen to you. And I thought, I've used pastel matte with water and alcohol in the past and never had a problem. So I thought, you know what, I better do a test just to make sure. I can't recommend something if it's not going to work out. Even if it had in the past, maybe pastel matte changed their formula. Not the case. I did a test and basically discovered something unexpected. Number one, the paper did not buckle, both with alcohol and with water. And I think the trick is, with any liquid, you have to use a small amount. In other words, don't just slop it on and get it wet and more wet and wet again. That's going to soak into the paper and it's going to buckle any paper. On the other hand, if you are a little bit less, a little bit more conservative with your use of the liquid, you're going to have better results. Now, what I discovered, this was the interesting part, is, and if we can have a look at this, I took my art graph squares, and basically these are pigment blocks. They're blocks of pigment, and I've talked about these and used these in past, both here on Patreon and on my blog. I love these things. They're just very richly pigmented squares and they last a long time. So I took white pastel matte and I put a little yellow, a little blue, a little red, mixed them together. And then on this side I used rubbing alcohol. On this side I used water. Now notice it didn't buckle at all, but what happened with the water really surprised me. It made the pigment so much more vibrant than this. This wet it, but it didn't do anything to the pigment. In other words, it didn't even activate it, whereas the water activated the pigment, and I got some interesting flowing things happening. But most importantly, look at how much more vibrant the water side is than the alcohol side. And I never really thought that it made a difference. This water took a long time to dry, probably over an hour, whereas the alcohol was dry in just minutes. So the one thing about pastel matte, it's cellulose fiber, so it's like a sponge. It soaks in the water and holds on to it. So like a sponge, it takes a while to dry out. But I'm going to use water today. Oh, we put alcohol in my thing. I'm going to use water today. So my camera person's going to go grab me some water. There's the cup. Because I want the vibrancy of the water. Whereas the alcohol, yeah, that's fine. There's water already in the cup. That'll work. The alcohol just didn't do it. But I want to caution you. You want to be conservative with your use of the water. Alright, so we'll take this and I'll make that into something. I don't want to waste any paper. And now let's look at our board here. What did we do last week? I cropped my photo. I did a grayscale value study. I used I think I used 4 values, just big simple shapes, connecting all the shapes whenever possible. And then I selected my palette. We did this last week, and I did a quick color study so that I could see if the colors were working for me. So this week we're going to do that all important underpainting. Next week we will start to add the pastels. So if you haven't selected your palette yet, you still have time to do that. This week we're only going to do the underpainting. And I really encourage you to slow down and paint along with me and really not try to rush through it or get ahead. If you have that urge to paint and you really want to finish, start something else. Because I am doing this for a reason, this slow down for a reason, and I want you to learn how to work efficiently but paying more attention to some of the details. And we can really only do that when we slow down. And I learned that lesson. It took me a long time because I always wanted to rush through everything. So if you're like me, you want to do something, you want to paint something else. So what I'm doing with a pencil very lightly is putting in my big simple shapes, and I'm looking at my little thumbnail and not my photo, because remember, I changed things in the photo. I took out that road, I moved the mountain over, so I want to make sure I look at this and not that, because then I'm going to get confused. So I have kind of a leading pathway through the snow. This will become a little bit more clear as we start to paint. And then we have that little house. You know what I think that is, just for your knowledge? It's a bus stop, like a bus stop shelter. I'm not really worried so much about the details of it. In fact, it's going to be a mere suggestion of a building. So as far as having it perfectly you know, like a perfect little building, I'm not so much worried about that. There's 2 trees here. I might make 3 or make a smaller bush, just because 2 is not as interesting as having 3. And then we have that nice big snowbank right in here, and it's nice glow from the lights. Now remember, we talked about last week, it was the lights that are letting the trees glow, so I'm going to put those in so I don't forget that idea. Alright, now that the initial drawing is in place, I'm going to use these Art Graph pigments to block in some color. If you don't have these, you could use a red, blue, and yellow hard pastel. Hard pastel is going to be better than a soft pastel, because when you liquefy soft pastels, really soft pastels, they tend to get gooey and fill in the tooth of the paper. Harder pastels are going to work better, but I'm going to use the red, blue, and yellow in the set. Now, I want to set this up for success, meaning I want to get a head start on the colors. And what do I love about this particular scene? It's the yellow, warm yellow glow against all the coolness of the snow in the shadows. So I'm going to start by blocking in the mountain shape with blue, and if you squint, notice in your photo that that mountain shape is much darker than the blue nighttime sky. You also will notice that there is snow on that mountain, but I'm not going to put the snow in the underpainting. Those are going to be those marks that I'll add on later in the painting, and it comes down to about here. There's distant snow back there. And I'm pressing down a little bit hard because I want this to be darker. Now, the sky is also that wonderful twilighty, nocturne blue sky. So it's also blue, but I'm going to apply the pastel lighter so that it's not as dark as the mountain. If I made it the same pressure, then they'd look the same and I'd lose my mountain. What else is blue? The snow is in the foreground. It's cool, it's in the shadows, so I'm going to kind of create a pathway through the snow, make the pathway a little bit darker, and make the remaining snow a little bit lighter. But what happens up here, where all of the lights and that little house is, it gets warmer or more yellow. It's got a yellow glow. So I'm going to add some yellow to this area and even up in these trees and in the snow and especially the front of the house. Now, interestingly, I should put some blue. I'm going to make it purple, so put some blue and red, and I'll get a little dark area on the shadowed side of the house. Now, in the distance, there's also some snow, but I'm going to make it a little bit of a greenish snow, just so that I remember that it's going to be different than the mountain. Pull down some of this yellow. I'm going to also, because I can, add some red to my yellow so I get more of a yellow orange. And we're going to talk a lot more about how we can get lights to glow at night. And so one of the things is to start darker than it really looks. So I'm going to make this more of a yellow orange. So now that we have this all done, we get to have fun with our water. Now I'm going to move my pastel so I don't spill the water all over. I'm using a very cheap, beat up chip brush from the hardware store. Because look what happens to the bristles when you use sanded paper. Now, pastel mat is kind of smooth as sanded papers go, but normally I use a rougher paper, and it really can beat up your brushes. So I'm going to start with the lightest areas first, and I'm going to wet them. I'm using a paper towel so that I'm not having it really, really super wet and drippy. And I'm going to start by wetting all of the yellow areas. Now look at how, and I'm using a very, very tiny bit of water, but look at how it just explodes with pigment. It's what I really love about the art graph. So if you have not tried those yet, put those on your wish list. And I'm just kind of scrubbing in the color. Take your time with this underpainting stage. I always like to say, you're not a house painter. You're not going to go from top to bottom just like this, or you're going to end up with blob of nothing. Take your time and slow down when you're doing your brush. You're wet. Now look at how, and I don't want it to drip into my mountain. So that means I had a little too much water on it. So this is the lighter blue, and I got lighter blue by just using a lighter touch with my pigment. You could do the same thing if you're using pastel. Just apply it in a light touch and you'll get it lighter. I'm going to go ahead and do that to the lighter snow shadows. Now you see where I had some drips happening? I don't really want those drips, but instead of panicking, I knew that I could just simply go over them to eliminate them. Alright, so now we can go ahead and do the dark, let's do this distant piece of snow. That was too much water, so you can see how it started to drip. Now the darker. You can see that because I pressed harder, that I'm getting a darker value of the blue. And I'm just scrubbing it in. Now I know that these are just big simple shapes, and I'll be able to go over these big simple shapes with pastel and I'll refine them then. So I'm not worried about the detail in this stage in this underpainting stage. I'm going to go ahead, oops, I didn't really get this yellow here, so I'll go ahead and do that. And then I'll go ahead and do my dark pathway. Now if you were with me when we worked on wildflowers, you remember that I made suggested pathways through the meadow. This is the same thing. It's not really there, but I'm creating it. Oh, I have one more little spot. That's the dark shadowed side of the house. Now look at my house. Really looks something dark back here. The house really looks way too big and it just doesn't look like a house, but just know that I'll be able to refine that, so really don't worry about how it looks. What you want is color, shapes, connected shapes, and interesting things start to happen when you add water or alcohol to any medium, such as these pigment blocks or even pastel. And that's going to give me something interesting and fun to respond to next week. Now this is pastel matte. It's going to take a while for it to dry, so I wouldn't be able to paint on it anyways. But what I want you to do this week is maybe rewatch this video, pause when you need to paint. So I went through the whole thing kind of quickly, but your job is to stop when you feel you need to stop, rather than me arbitrarily saying, okay, now it's your turn. You guys press pause when you want to paint along with me, or watch to the end and then do your part. If you've got any questions, ask them in the comments. I'm happy to help. And I think we're going to have a lot of fun with this scene, so let's have fun with the underpainting this week and let's paint.